In this video, I'm going to teach you how to use the MITI 4.1. MITI stands for Motivational Interviewing Treatment Integrity. And this is a coding system that is used to determine if somebody is actually practicing motivational interviewing. So let's get started. There are two components of the MITI coding system. The first component is global scores, and the second component is behavioral counts. First, let me tell you a little bit about global scores. Global scores are basically like using a rubric, if you've ever used a rubric before. There are 4 different categories: cultivating change talk, softening sustained talk, partnership, and empathy. And for each of these categories, you basically get a score of 1 through 5, depending on how these different qualities are expressed. It's best to do the global scores at the very end of watching a session. And I'll show you in a second that for each of these 4 categories, you use a rubric to score, to give yourself a score, or the person that you're watching a score for each of the 4 categories I mentioned. The other component of the MITI coding system is the behavior counts. And I actually recommend doing the behavior counts first. So when you're sitting down and you're watching a motivational interviewing session, you're going to focus on the behavior counts. Then at the end of the session, you'll probably want to go back and think about the scoring for the 4 categories for the global scores. Okay, so the behavior counts really are just a tally system. So you're watching an MI session, you're listening for questions, reflections, etc., and you're literally making a tally mark on your coding sheet each time you hear different different types of questions and reflections, etc. So as you're watching the session on video, you'll often need to sort of pause the video, and you may even need to rewind and go back and listen again, but you're basically just creating little tally marks on a coding sheet as you hear different things that the counselor says. And then, like I said, at the end, once the session is complete, you can go back and look at the global scores rubrics and give the person a score for each of the 4 categories of the global score rubric. The first one's cultivating change talk, and that's part of your technical score. Softening sustained talk, which is also part of the technical score on your score sheet. And then the 2 relational scores are partnership and empathy. And those 4 make up the global scores rubric. So now let's move on to behavior counts. So again, you have a score sheet in front of you as you're watching your video, and you're making tally marks and counting up different things the clinician says. Before we dive into behavior counts, I need to define a few terms for you. The first term is a volley. A volley is basically within a script is anything the clinician says and the client doesn't really have much of a response. So anytime the client responds with something meaningful, then that's the end of that volley. In this example, you'll see that the client interjects here, but doesn't really say much, kind of says, yeah, no, sure. Those types of interjections don't technically stop the volley. And so even though the client spoke in between these 2 clinician statements, we're still calling this this whole thing a single volley. Okay. So this will make more sense why in a moment. So within this volley, this single volley, we have a couple different utterances, right? In other words, we have a couple different complete thoughts, or we have a couple different sentences. We have 3 to be exact. The clinician says, you aren't enthusiastic about that idea. The client says, no. The clinician says, you're someone who prefers to do things more naturally. What types of behavior changes did you have in mind? So those 3 utterances, each, you look at them individually because some are reflections, some are questions, right? But they're all within the same volley, meaning the client hasn't said anything substantial, and so we're collapsing all of these utterances into a single volley. Okay, so let's talk about how we code these different utterances. Well, there are three categories and there are 8 possible codes, which makes this a little complicated. These 8 possible codes are on your code sheet. So you'll see a code for giving information, you'll see a code for question, and then you'll see a code for simple reflection or complex reflection. And then you'll see a code for affirmations, seeking collaboration, emphasizing autonomy, and then persuading or confronting. Okay. So those are the 8 possible codes. You can see that they're sort of collapsed into 3 different categories. Some of these are very, MI adherent things to do. Some are very MI non-adherent things to do. And then we have giving information, questions, and reflections, which are more in that neutral zone. Okay, so one thing to note is not everything that the practitioner says is coded. So, for example, if the practitioner says, "Gosh, you sound exhausted," okay, that's a type of reflection. We'll talk in a second about whether that would be considered a simple reflection or a complex reflection. We know that's a type of reflection. And then the second utterance, I know that I know what that was like. I had to deal with that problem myself. Okay, that's maybe something a practitioner would say. We call that self-disclosure when you kind of share something about yourself. And that doesn't actually receive a code. Okay. And then the third utterance, it sounds like you want to find a solution and you're working really hard for it. That's an affirmation. Okay. So 3 different complete thoughts or sentences, 3 different utterances. The first one's coded as a reflection. The second thing is not coded. And the third utterance is coded as an affirmation. Okay. So let's go back to this first example. How would you code these 3 different utterances? Well, first of all, the first one is a reflection. It's reflecting back what the client just said. The second one is also a reflection. And since this is all in a single volley, because the client didn't really break up these different utterances with anything meaningful, the clinician kind of provides another reflection. And then the third utterance is an open-ended question, right? Well, what's interesting in this coding system is these 2 utterances back to back that are reflections within a single volley. You don't count those as 2 separate reflections. You basically count them as one reflection. Okay? So again, when it comes to reflections, if you have more than one reflection in a single volley, like we do in this example, we only count the reflection once. So this example would be coded as a complex reflection and a question. So even though we have 3 utterances, we're giving 1 tally mark under complex reflection, and we're giving 1 tally mark under question. Okay? And we'll talk more about the difference between simple reflection and complex reflection in just a moment. All right, so the next the next category of coding I want to talk about is giving information. This is anytime you give any information. It could be, you let the client know what their lab values are, or you let the client know what the research says. Here's an example. Research supports that taking the focus off of weight loss and instead focusing on sustaining health behaviors is a more viable long-term solution for most people. So that's an example of I'm just sharing what the research says. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do anything that's like warning, like, oh, if you don't stop drinking soda, you're going to end up in the hospital. That's not an MI adherent thing to say. So that's not a giving information. Giving informations are they're neutral in tone, they're neutral in form. I'm not trying to persuade you, I'm just giving you the information. Okay, so one sort of exception is this statement, take a look at a list of changes people often make who have high blood pressure and see if there are any on here that interest you. That is sort of a giving information sounding thing to say, but this actually gets coded as a structuring type of utterance and therefore doesn't really get coded. So anytime someone says, oh, take a look at this list of changes and see if there's anything on here that interests you, that actually doesn't get coded using this system because it's more of a structuring type of thing to say. So giving information, again, from my professional experience, I think that going to cardiac rehab is the best choice for people in situations like yours. So it's kind of done in a neutral fashion, whereas it's going to be coded as either persuade or confront, which are non-MI adherent, when it's worded like this. From my professional experience, I think going to cardiac rehab is the best choice for you. That's definitely more in a persuasion type of tone. Or I recommend that you always wear a bike helmet. It really protects you in the event of a crash. That's persuading. And then confront is, well, you're only eating 2 fruits and vegetables a day. This isn't enough if you're trying to get 5, that kind of thing. So giving information, again, is just anytime you give information in a very neutral manner without trying to persuade or confront. The next behavior count I want to teach you about is questions. Questions are actually the easiest thing to code because any question gets, for the most part, any question gets the question code. Whether it's close-ended or open-ended, everything gets a question code, okay? And sometimes when you're counseling, you ask a question and then you might like reframe the question in the same utterance or breath. When you do that, maybe on paper you have 2 questions, but it only gets coded as a single question. So again, back-to-back questions in a single volley only get coded as one question. So here's an example. What types of activities do you enjoy? Which activities are most fun for you? Technically, those are 2 questions, but it only gets coded as a single question because it's, one question per volley. So again, for questions, you code it as a question, whether it's complex or simple. You code it as a question, whether it's close-ended or open-ended. Okay, moving on to reflections. So for reflections, again, you only code 1 reflection per volley. So even when there might be several sort of reflections in a row in a single volley, it only gets coded as a single reflection. So the whole utterance gets coded as a single reflection. So that means that there really isn't a summaries code. It's really, several reflections may look like a summary, but there isn't a summary code in this coding system. So you just code that whole volley as 1 reflection. Now you have to figure out, well, was that a simple reflection or a complex reflection? Here is the difference. A simple reflection stays really close to the original meaning that the client intended. A complex reflection tends to kind of move the conversation in a new direction because it's often taking a guess at something that you think the client is experiencing, but not necessarily verbalizing. So I'll say that again. A simple reflection is coded as a reflection is coded as a simple reflection when you're really sticking to the original meaning that the client is describing, sometimes using a lot of the same words the client's using. And it gets coded as a complex reflection when you're taking a guess at things that the client might be sort of meaning, but isn't necessarily saying, okay? So complex reflections are really great in motivational interviewing because they tend to kind of push the conversation forward. Another word for complex reflections is actually forward-moving reflections. And so you can start noticing reflections that are more forward-moving. So here are some examples. The clinician says, what have you already been told about managing your blood sugar levels? The client says, are you kidding? I've had the classes, I've watched videos, I've had the home nurse visits, I've had all kinds of advice about how to get better at this, but I just don't do it. I don't know why I don't do it. Maybe I have a death wish or something, So the clinician says, gosh, you're pretty discouraged about this. You don't know why you're sabotaging yourself. Okay. So see how the clinician actually kind of says 2 sentences or 2 utterances? Well, it only gets coded as 1 reflection. And in this case, the clinician saying, you don't know why you're sabotaging yourself. That's a complex reflection because that's really taking a guess at maybe what is going on, but the client didn't actually kind of use that language or say that themselves. Here's another example. Client says, I'm so tired of being told what to do. No one understands how difficult this is for me. And the clinician might say, you feel like no one gets it. That's a simple reflection, kind of staying close to the original meaning. But if the clinician says, you're angry and you're frustrated, that's a complex reflection. They're kind of taking a guess at some emotions that that the client might be experiencing, but hasn't necessarily said outright. Okay, so affirmations. How do you count up affirmations? Well, affirmations are anything that accentuates something positive about the client. It's usually their character strengths, their efforts. It's usually an affirmation about their intentions or their worth. So an example might be, you came up with some good ideas on how it might be easiest for you to make this change. It's affirming them that they're good at coming up with ideas, or you care about your health. That's an affirmation. Now, one thing that is not an affirmation but sounds a little bit like it is what we call cheerleading. So when you say, gosh, I'm so proud of you, or good job, you did it, that's called cheerleading. That's not affirmation. Okay. So you don't code cheerleading statements, and honestly, you don't want a lot of cheerleading going on in a health coaching session. Instead, what you really want are affirmations, which are more specific towards certain characteristics or qualities that you notice within the client. The next behavior count that you'll want to be noticing is something called seeking collaboration. And this is anytime the clinician attempts to partner or share power or acknowledge the client's expertise. So the two times I find myself coding seek collaboration the most is, first of all, when the clinician asks the client what he or she thinks after information's provided. So maybe you provide information and then you say, what do you think about what I just shared with you? Or what do you think about the lab values I just gave you? That's an example of something that gets coded as seeking collaboration. Another example is whenever the clinician remembers to ask permission before giving the client information. So something like, I could share with you the latest research on blood sugars and what foods affect it if you're interested. Okay, so that's an example of asking permission. Anytime you see asking permission being done, you code that as seeking collaboration. All right, excuse me about the phone call that I had to take. So we were talking about seeking collaboration, how there are two real common times that you might do this. One is when you ask permission before giving information, and also when you check in with the client after you provide information to see what the client thinks of the information that you provided. So here's some examples. Would it be all right with you if we talked more about body image? Or can I share what's worked for other clients of mine? Or what do you think about mindful eating or a non-diet approach now that I've told you a little bit about it? So those are all examples of questions that would not get coded as questions. Instead, they would be coded as seeking collaboration. Okay, so even again, sometimes there are questions that don't get coded as questions. Instead, they get coded as seeking collaboration. So here is an example of a dialogue and with the codings in place. So the clinician says, what do you already know about the benefits of physical activity? That gets coded as a question. And the client says, I know it's good for your heart. Clinician says, yeah, it is. Would you be interested in hearing about other benefits that are less well known? That's an example of seeking collaboration. The client says, sure. And then the clinician says, many aren't aware of the many benefits physical activity can have on mental health. It has been proven to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. So that's an example of giving information. And then the clinician says, what do you make of this information? And that's, again, an example of seeking collaboration. So the next behavior count is emphasizing autonomy. And this is anything the clinician says that really highlights the client's sense of control, freedom of choice. Again, anything that really emphasizes it's up to the client to decide. And so whenever a clinician says something like, you know yourself best, you know what will work best for you, it's really up to you what you decide. You're thinking about the pros and the cons of trying to make a change and figuring out what's best for you. So anything that emphasizes, I'm just here to help, but really whatever you want to do, that gets coded as emphasizing autonomy. All right, now moving into the MI non-adherent categories, we've got persuade and confront. So anytime the clinician makes an attempt to change the client's opinions or attitudes or behavior, this is persuading. So they may try to use logic or compelling arguments, or even self-disclosure, like, I go to the gym in the morning. It sort of implies that they're trying to persuade you to go to the gym in the morning, or persuade their client to go to the gym in the morning. So basically, anytime information is given, but there's a tone to it, whereas you're not really emphasizing client autonomy, but you're sort of pressuring, then it gets coded as persuading. So here's an example. You need to try to eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day. It's going to be really hard to do this without eating breakfast. That's an example of persuading. Anytime there's like, you should, or you need to do this, or you've really got to do this, that's gets coded as persuade. Now here is another version, which is called persuade with permission. So A1C, by the way, is a blood sugar, reading the lab value. So your blood sugars are out of control. You should really switch over to insulin at this point. What do you think about that? So it's like, well, okay, it's good that they're asking permission or asking what the client thinks, but it's still a persuasion. So it's called persuade with permission. Like you're persuading, but at least you're asking permission. But it's still in the MI non-adherent category. And then there's confront. So anytime you're disagreeing, arguing, correcting, shaming, blaming, criticizing, labeling, warning, moralizing, ridiculing, or questioning the client's honesty, like, you think they're lying or something. That's all confronting. So here's an example. Remember how your triglycerides were high? If you don't get them under control, you could be in serious danger. That's confronting. And then there are some things in a session that really just aren't coded. So at the beginning, you're watching a session, they might say, hi, Joe, I'm Susie, or thanks for coming in today, or, did you watch the Super Bowl? Wow, what a great game. Those are things that aren't coded. So generally, the coding doesn't start until after you kind of build a little bit of rapport with the client. Also facilitative statements like, oh, yeah, okay, or okay, sure, right, uh-huh, oh, good. Those little fillers that we sometimes do, they're fine to say, but you just wouldn't code them as anything. Another thing you wouldn't code is if you said something like, last time we met, you talked about drinking water. You wouldn't code that. Anytime you bring up things that happened in previous sessions, you wouldn't code those. We don't all speak in complete sentences, but sometimes a clinician might start a sentence and then the client interrupts the clinician, and so they don't even get a complete thought out. Well, obviously you don't know where that thought was going, so you can't really code it. So you don't code incomplete sentences or incomplete thoughts. I shouldn't say incomplete sentences, because sometimes we talk in incomplete sentences, but you can still tell what we're saying. So I'd say more importantly, you don't code incomplete thoughts. And then, yeah, you don't code anything that's sort of off topic. So if you kind of get off on a tangent, like about the client's trip or traveling experience, you don't really code that, or talking about a football game or the weather outside. You don't code the off topic material. Okay, so those are things that don't get coding. So not everything that's said in a session by the clinician is actually going to receive a code. So there's two ways to code. You can type out the whole interview. So you're watching the video and you're typing really fast to type out a script and then code the script. But honestly, that takes a long time. I think the other way to code is a much faster way, though it may not be quite as accurate. And that is to code while you're listening or watching the interview by making the tally marks on a coding sheet. So that's what I'd recommend you try. And you can always pause the video and replay certain parts as you try to code each utterance. So do behavior count coding while watching and listening the first time. And it is best to kind of watch that video a second time to give those global scores. But if you don't have time to watch the whole video a second time, you often will have a sense of their global scores just by watching it that first time and counting up their behavioral counts. Now, after you watch the video, count up the behavioral counts, and give those global score ratings, then the next step is to do some summary calculations. And so I provided these summary calculations on the next slide, and then you can compare the results of those calculations to what's considered proficiency by the MITI coding folks who developed this system. Okay. So here's the MITI coding sheet that you will use. You'll see at the top box the global scores. So you'll just give a score 1 through 5 for each of those 4 global scores. And you can write comments to yourself about why you gave that person, the score that you did. And then the box below is the behavioral counts, and that's where you will put the tally marks so that each time you hear each of those things happen, you put a tally mark. And then you total up the number of tally marks in the right-hand column. So it's pretty straightforward. And then after you have done that, you take your coding sheet and you put the scores into these mathematical equations. So to figure out a technical global score, you add up cultivating change talk plus softening sustained talk scores and you divide it by 2. To get a relational global score, you add up partnership score plus empathy score divided by 2. To figure out the percent of complex reflections, you would do complex reflections divided by simple reflections plus complex reflections. And again, your goal here is to get as many complex reflections as possible, and so that more of your reflections are complex. You also can calculate your reflection to question ratio. What you're shooting for in your own counseling is 2 reflections for every 1 question that you ask. And so this is how you figure out how close you are to that recommended ratio. And then you can create a total MI adherent score and then a total MI non-adherent score. And so these are the scores that you'll report on whenever you watch a video. And then you use this table to figure out how those scores compare to what's considered, fair or kind of on the right track but not there yet, and then good, meaning like you're pretty proficient at motivational interviewing at this point. Okay, so you compare the scores from the previous slide to this table to get a sense of whether you're on the right track. Now notice there are no total motivational interviewing adherent and total motivational interviewing non-adherent benchmarks. Those are just, scores to kind of keep in mind, but there's been no set benchmarks for those.